Hi. Today I'd like to speak about some passages from Revelation chapter 3 in regard to how they relate to the rapture of faithful believers who will be brought into the Father's house. We read in Revelation chapter 3 verse 7 where Christ addresses the church of Philadelphia. We read, "Unto the angel of the church in Philadelphia write these things, says he that is holy, he that is true, he that has the key of David, he that opens and no man shuts, and shuts and no man opens." Christ begins by describing himself as he that is holy and he that is true. But then he goes on to speak of himself as he that has the key of David. With these words, Christ seems to be alluding to Isaiah chapter 22, verse 22. The context of this passage is dealing with the removal of Hezekiah's servant Shebna from his place of authority. Shebna was a chief assistant of the king, a treasurer who had the authority to distribute the king's resources. He was Lord Chamberlain, having the master key to all the doors in the king's palace, having the right to open and close them at will. This would include chambers which contained precious possessions of the king, such as silver and gold and spices, precious ointment, armor, and so forth. In particular, Shebna, as the chamberlain, had the right to give people access to various chambers, including the king's very throne room. Shebna had a very high and powerful position. However, unlike King Hezekiah, who was a good man, Shebna was a wicked man and was interested in glorifying himself and was potentially a traitor. I read that some Jewish historians believed he tried to conspire with the Assyrians in an attack on Jerusalem. It was because of Shebna's flawed character and his corrupt attitude that Jehovah had a prophecy spoken against him in regard to how he would be removed from his high position and be replaced with someone faithful. That faithful person we read of in Isaiah chapter 22, verse 20, is Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah. This man, Eliakim, would be exalted to the place of honor and authority that Shebna once had. In Isaiah 22, verse 22, Jehovah declares he would be given the key of the house of David. It basically meant that he would become the chief steward of the king's palace, having the right to dispense of the king's wealth. He would have rights to all the various chambers in the palace and have the authority to allow people to enter or prevent people from entering those various chambers, including the king's chamber. This seems to be alluded to in verse 22. So he shall open and none shall shut, and he shall shut and none shall open. In other words, under the king, he would have exclusive authority to all the doors and the chambers in the king's palace. Eliakim would be a faithful steward, even being a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and the house of Judah. His government would be relatively sure and lasting, as Jehovah declares Eliakim would be fastened as a nail in his position. However, his government would come to an end, for in Isaiah 22:25, in that day says, as we read it, in that day says Jehovah of hosts, shall the nail that is fastened in the sure place be removed and be cut down and fall, and the burden that was upon it shall be cut off, for Jehovah has spoken it. Now, some believe this nail is alluding to the unrighteous Shebna who would be removed, but I would submit that because in the previous text, Jehovah declared Eliakim would be fixed as the sure peg, that it's the reign of Eliakim who is in view in verse 25 that would indeed one day come to an end. The obvious reason is that there would be one who would be even greater and more faithful than Eliakim, who would be the chief steward over Jerusalem and ultimately our Father's house in heaven. And it's this very chief steward that Yeshua is claiming to be in Revelation 3, verse 7. Again, as he describes himself, he that has the key of David, he that opens and no man shuts, and shuts and no man opens. Again, the Lord Chamberlain of a palace had a master key to the house so that he would have control over its doors, being able to unlock and open any door and close and then lock any door. This gave him unique authority and control over the house as who can enter it. And so it is with Christ and the Father's kingdom and his spiritual house. Because he has the master key, so to speak, to the house, he has the right to open the doors to allow people access to the various treasures of the Father's house. And in particular, people who believe in Christ have the right to walk through the very door of the Father's throne room, to have the great privilege to have an audience with him and enjoy his presence. But Christ also has the right to shut the door to the Father's house, to keep people out and prevent them from accessing its treasures, such as the very treasure of enjoying communion with the Father himself. But having declared himself to basically be the chief steward of the Father's household, Christ then goes on in verse 8 to give his assessment of the church of Philadelphia by declaring his knowledge of their works. He says, I know thy works. Of course, this is not a surface limited knowledge that Christ had of their works, but a deep comprehensive knowledge of the things this church had done in the name of Christ. Christ would have all the Christians in this church know that he is fully aware of everything they have ever done in his name. Yeshua then goes on to declare to them, I have set before thee an open door, and no man can shut it. The address to the church of Philadelphia began with Christ being described as the one who opens and no man shuts, and shuts and no man opens. The point of that was to emphasize the sovereign control Christ has over his spiritual house, where only he has the authority to determine who can enter and who is to be shut out. And we see an allusion to this authority in Christ's statement in verse 8, for he speaks of having set before the Philadelphian believers an open door. The implication is that Christ opened the door for these believers to enable them to come into the Father's house or palace. But not only was this door opened by Christ through his power, but it would remain open by his power. For he declares no man can shut it, regardless of how much the forces of darkness wanted to close this door. It would remain open because the very will and hand of an omnipotent divine being kept it opened, namely Christ himself. Christ then gives the reason why he opened this door before them, as he says, for thou hast a little strength and hast kept my word and hast not denied my name. The little strength may refer to the fact that this church was conscious of its weakness and frailty and shortcomings, and they were mindful of the sins they struggled with and their imperfections. They were not a high-minded people thinking they were so mighty and powerful. They were not like the Laodicean church, who said they were rich and increased with goods and had needed nothing. Instead, these Philadelphian believers knew themselves to be poor and needy and depended on Christ for help and strength. Yet although they were conscious of their lack of strength, or maybe not as strong as Christ would like them to have been, the strength they had was still pleasing to him. But in addition to their little strength, another reason Christ set before the Philadelphian believers an open door is because of their faithfulness to him, as Christ declares, for you have a little strength and have kept my word and have not denied my name. When Yeshua speaks of them keeping his word, that is referring to how they kept his word in their hearts and in their lives. They treasured it within them in their mind and meditated on it regularly. Isaiah 66 verse 5 speaks of those who tremble at Jehovah's word. So it is with these Philadelphian believers. They trembled at Christ's word. It affected them emotionally in that they were fearful of violating it. For they did not want to disobey and dishonor their master. Not that they feared they would go to hell, but because they loved Christ and were simply afraid of offending the one they loved. They kept Christ's word in their hearts and were so resigned to submit to it out of devotion to Christ that it manifested in their lives through obedience, through keeping Christ's commands. And the means by which they kept Christ's word was because of the strength they had. It may have been a little strength, but it was sufficient strength to enable them to keep Christ's word. An intimate connection with how they faithfully obeyed Christ's word, Christ also commends them for not denying his name. It appears from what we read in Revelation 3:9 that these Philadelphian believers had been persecuted in some manner by Jewish people. However, although they may have been tempted to forsake Christ and deny his name to escape persecution, they remained faithful to him, as Christ declared, that they had not denied his name. This is one of the traits of the great saints of the faith that we read of in Hebrews chapter 11. It speaks of those who chose rather to suffer than to endure the pleasures of sin and to deny Christ in some way. So it is with these Philadelphian believers. They were placed in scenarios where they had the option of disowning Christ to escape suffering. Yet we see that they chose to suffer and endure hardship, to endure the frowns and afflictions by others rather than deny the name of Christ. In addition, consider that Philadelphia was a very idolatrous city. I read that the city was actually known as Little Athens. If a person was to walk through the city, they would see so many temples and idols that it would remind them of Athens, which was the center of worship for all Olympian gods in Greece. Yet despite such a high concentration of idolatry in the city and its opposition towards the Christian faith, these Philadelphian believers refused to be conformed to that corrupt culture. They never denied the name of Christ, but rather chose to honor and uphold his name regardless of the cost. It's because of the faithfulness of these Philadelphian believers, that because of their little strength, because they kept Christ's word and didn't deny him, that Christ set before them an open door. Now, I realize some believe this door is actually referring to evangelistic opportunities that Christ is giving to this church. And we find in the New Testament the concept of an open door relating to evangelism. For example, when writing to the Colossians, one of the things Paul does is he uses the language of a door being opened as a metaphor for being given opportunities to preach the gospel. So we see that the New Testament does use the concept of the figure of the opening of a door to convey the idea of an opportunity to minister to others and spread the truth. However, I don't believe that is what is in view in Revelation 3:8 when Christ speaks of himself opening a door. For there's little in the context of Revelation 3 that suggests that a door of opportunity to serve or to do work is in view. And also why the concept of a door of opportunity being opened for evangelists to evangelize is found in the New Testament, as we've seen in some of the texts I cited. We don't actually ever see such language used when addressing an entire church. Of course, I realize Revelation 3 may indeed be the one time in the Bible that an entire church is told of a door of opportunity being opened before them to serve. I just don't see the biblical support to insist upon that as the proper understanding of the text. Rather, the context suggests that this open door is related to the fact that these faithful believers had access to the Father's house and his presence. Consider again that Revelation 3:7 speaks of Christ having the key of David. Again, this is an allusion to Isaiah 22, verse 22, in regard to the promoting of faithful like him to be the chief steward. Again, being a chief steward didn't so much entail the idea of opening doors of opportunity for others to serve. Rather, to reiterate what I mentioned earlier, the chief steward was one who had the authority to access and dispense of the king's resources. The chief steward had the master key and the right to open and close the doors in the king's palace. This would include the authority to open the very door to the king's throne room to allow people the privilege of coming into the king's presence. This is something of the context of Christ's words when he speaks of having the key of David and the right to open and shut doors. Christ seems to be alluding to the fact that he alone can dispense of the Father's treasures, and he alone can give someone access to the Father's presence. Christ is the master of the Father's house, and he has the key to that house so that only he can unlock the door and open it to allow people into that house. And he can also shut the door and keep people out. And one way Christ will manifest the fact that he indeed has the key of David and has the authority to open and shut doors will be during his 1,000-year reign on the earth. For he will determine who is allowed entry into the Messianic kingdom and who will be forbidden to enter. But in addition, there's another application or fulfillment of Christ's words which would apply in the lives of the Philadelphian believers in the church age, and all believers in the church age. Consider that in verse 9, Christ speaks of those who are of the synagogue of Satan. They are those, he says, which say they are Jews and are not, but do lie. I understand that in the city of Philadelphia at this time that Christ spoke these words, there was a community of Jews who were hostile towards the Gentile believers. One of the things the Jews claim is that they and they alone had sole access to Jehovah. That is, they believed that the door to the throne room of the Father's house was open to them alone, and that ultimately this door would be shut to all Gentiles. But we know this was a flawed idea because according to the New Testament, Jehovah is no respecter of persons. And that anyone from any nation is accepted by him if he fears Jehovah and trusts in his Son. But because many of these Jews rejected Christ and his infallible revelation in the New Testament, they refused to believe that the Gentiles were the people of Jehovah. They would have asserted that the door to the Father's presence was shut to them. And it seems to be in light of this context that Christ goes on to encourage these faithful Philadelphian believers in Revelation 3, verse 8. That is contrary to what the unbelieving Jews had thought. The door to the Father's house was not shut to them, but instead it was opened before them. These Gentile believers in Philadelphia indeed had access to the very throne room of Jehovah because their sins had been atoned for, and because of the Spirit of Jehovah in their hearts, because Yeshua interceded for them, they were able to and free to call out on Jehovah as their Father and enter into his presence and enjoy communion with him. However, I believe there may be another layer to the meaning of the door that Christ had opened before these Philadelphian believers. Namely, I believe this door is referring to the actual door to heaven that will enable believers to enter the Father's house after the rapture. So while believers have an open door to commune with the Father in Christ at any time during their earthly life, and they will have access to the millennial kingdom, there's still a time coming when they will enter through a literal door opened by Christ to enable them to leave this world and enter the Father's house. This door to heaven is mentioned or alluded to at times in the Bible. Consider the parable of the virgins in Matthew 25, verse 10. In regard to the foolish virgins, we read, "And while they went to buy, the bridegroom came, and they that were ready went in with him to the marriage, and the door was shut." This seems to allude to the fact that at the time of the rapture, the bridegroom will come and catch up all believers into the air. And they will all eventually travel through an open door to heaven to eventually attend the marriage of the Lamb. And after they travel through the door, that same door will be shut, leaving the unfaithful professing believers behind. We also have the account of Noah and the ark at the time of the flood. We read that Jehovah commanded Noah to enter the ark, and after he and his family entered the ark, Jehovah shut the door, as Genesis 7, verse 16 indicates. Many believe this account is foreshadowing the time right before the tribulation begins, when raptured believers will go through the door of heaven into the Father's house, and once they're all in, Christ shuts the door, and Yahweh will begin to pour out judgment on the inhabitants of the earth. Lastly, consider that in Revelation 4:1, John tells us he sees a door opened in heaven. As he says, "After this I looked, and behold, a door was open in heaven." First of all, consider the use of the word behold, which seems to suggest that this door John sees was something very impressive, astonishing to the eyes. And know that this same word is used by Christ in Revelation 3:8 when he speaks of an open door before the Philadelphian believers, which also may suggest that the door opened before them was indeed something very glorious and astonishing. Revelation 4:1, John sees a door open in heaven, and he was called up into heaven. And the implication is that he would travel through that door. And the person who opened the door was likely Christ himself. As we've seen from Revelation 3:8, Christ has the key of David, the key to the Father's house, and he's the one who opens the door to enable people to come in. I don't believe it's a coincidence that shortly after John hears of Christ's authority to open a door, they actually ends up seeing an open door to heaven before him, and he's basically being commanded to travel through the door into the Father's presence. This seems to be the case with the door that Christ has opened before the church of Philadelphia, as we read in Revelation 3:8. Because of their great faithfulness, they had the privilege of eventually going through this door to heaven. And when they traveled through this door, the door would be shut behind them and the tribulation would begin on the earth. Now consider that this idea is in complete harmony with the very promise Christ makes to the church of Philadelphia in verse 10, where he tells them he will keep them from the hour of trial that will come upon all the world. It would seem that the very means by which the faithful believers in Philadelphia would be kept from the hour of trial is by going through the open door Christ has set before them. They will obviously be first raptured off the earth, gathered to Christ, and then they as all one body will go through the open door into the Father's house to eventually partake of the marriage of the Lamb. In connection to the parable of the virgins I mentioned earlier, they are the wise virgins who will go through the door. And that same door will be shut, and the foolish virgins will be left outside of that closed door to heaven, and they will end up pleading with Christ for it to be opened to them. In addition, consider that Revelation 3:9 seems to be an allusion to the rapture as well. In regard to the Jews who are of the synagogue of Satan, Christ says, "I will make them to come and worship before thy feet, and to know that I have loved thee." Christ promises that because of their patience, he will make these Jews worship before their feet. Now, some suggest this could have been fulfilled long ago when certain Jews who had persecuted the Philadelphian believers eventually got saved and ended up bowing the knee in worship to Christ. I believe that is possible, that there was some kind of historical fulfillment to this. However, in light of the eschatological language and context of Revelation 3 and Revelation as a whole, I would argue that this passage may also be understood to be in regard to the salvation of some of the Jews at the time of the rapture. I start to demonstrate in a prior video that the rapture of the Gentiles may be instrumental in regard to the salvation of many of the Jews. I also suggested that at the day of the rapture, when believers are glorified, some of them may even appear to Jewish unbelievers, including those in Jerusalem. And I suggested Jehovah might use the experience of Jews seeing glorified raptured Gentiles to provoke them to jealousy, which will contribute to their conversion, which I believe is what Romans chapter 11 may be alluding to. I also mentioned that it could be that the 144,000 who are said to be the first fruits unto Jehovah may actually be the very first Jews who are saved after the rapture. And I think it's possible at the time of the rapture, because of Jehovah's pouring out of his Spirit on some of the Jewish people, that many of these Jews will literally fall down and worship at the feet of glorified saints. Not that they worship the saints, of course, but only that the location where many of them may fall down to worship Jehovah will be at the very feet of glorified Gentile believers. This may be precisely what Christ is promising to these faithful Philadelphian believers, and ultimately all believers who are alive at the time of the rapture. Namely, that some of the very Jews who may have persecuted and mocked them will one day become truly saved. And their salvation may actually be due to them being provoked to jealousy by seeing them glorified. Note that not only will those Jews worship Jehovah, they will also know that Christ loves these Gentile believers. This is what Christ seems to allude to at the end of Revelation 3:9, where he says, I will make them to come and worship before thy feet and to know that I have loved thee. Certainly, if some Jews have the Spirit working in their hearts when Christ comes for his bride, and they literally see faithful, glorified Gentiles, we can be pretty certain they will truly know that those Gentiles are indeed loved by the very Messiah they had rejected for so long. And that may indeed provoke them to a holy jealousy to lead them to fall down as they turn to and worship Jehovah. In addition, Revelation 3:11 and Revelation 3:12 also contain promises that are related to the rapture as well, namely in regard to the various rewards that will be given to the saints after the rapture. In other words, it's the reality of the blessed hope that appears to be the theme and substance of Christ's promise to this faithful church of Philadelphia. Thus, it's in keeping with this theme that it's reasonable to conclude that the open door in Revelation 3:8 is not so much related to an open door of opportunity to serve on the earth, but instead it's referring to the door that Christ, as the chief steward, the master of the Father's house, will open at the time of the rapture to enable all faithful believers who have kept his word to enter the Father's house and into the Father's very presence. Lastly, I want to mention that I'm in the process of finishing up a more thorough, extensive teaching on the promise in Revelation 3:10 to help demonstrate how this passage does indeed seem to lend support to the pre-tribulation rapture position. So please feel free to be on the lookout for that teaching if you're interested. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. If you have any questions or comments, please feel to leave them in the comment section below. Thank you again.